guys. Okay, settle down now, settle down now. Take your seats, we're starting now. Welcome guys to Planet Mythral's first Middle-earth strategy battle game university class. And today I'm just going to be focusing on the basic principles of the movement phase, the first of three phases that make up the overall arcing turn. So yes, in this first class it will just be the basic principles of how you move models on the tabletop. We'll be going into some of the more minutiae and detail in regard to elevation and terrain types, things like that in another episode, but this is just to cover the overarching basic principles of the movement phase. Now the player who has priority, who won the priority role in the priority phase, will get the chance to move all their models first, aside from heroic actions, but again, that's something for a later class in the semester. During the movement phase, you can move each one of your models up to their maximum move value. This is represented on a character's stat line by the figure in inches at the very start of the stat line. Each model moves completely independently from its counterparts. There is no unit cohesion or anything to worry about after you've deployed as a warband. It's important to note you must always completely finish one model's movement before moving on to a second model. You cannot start a movement with one model, move over to someone else, and then come back to finish that one off. Once you leave that model, it is there until the start of the next movement phase. Now there are lots and lots of different models in the game, as we all know. Quite a lot have their own different move value. For example, hobbits have a move value of 4 inches. Models such as goblins and dwarfs have a move value of 5 inches. Standard man-sized infantry and some bigger beasts, for example the trolls, the great beasts of Gorgoroth and the Warmamak, they have a 6-inch movement value. This is generally the most common move value you'll see across the models in the range. A few models, such as the Bjorning Bears, have a move value of 8 inches. Generally speaking, most cavalry have a movement value of 10 inches. A few exceptions of these include heroic horses such as Shadowfax and any of the Nereus models. And eagles and fell beasts have a flying move of 12 inches. To advance the model, place your measuring template at the front of a model's base and advance the model along the template until the front of the base matches with the maximum move value on the tape measure. Always measure from front to front, never from back to back or from back to front. Now you don't have to travel in straight lines. In order to avoid certain obstacles and possible hazardous terrain, you may move however you wish, as long as when you finish your movement, you have not exceeded your maximum move value, as stated on the stat line. Terrain can have big impacts on a model's move. Difficult terrain, for example, halves a model's maximum move value whilst it's moving within it. Again to note, this is only while you are in the terrain. If you start, for example, 2 inches into terrain, it will cost you 4 inches to leave that terrain, at which point then you can move a further 2 inches freely outside of the terrain. Elevation and jumping also have big effects on a model, but that's a topic for a later class. We will go into that, but not in today's lesson. Models may not move through other models. There must always be enough space for a model's base to fit through in order for it to move past another intervening model. If there's not enough space, the model will either have to go around or just wait nice and patiently until either the model has moved in front of it or until the next movement phase and it can then go round. All charges are done in the movement phase. Models that end their movement in base contact with an enemy model are considered to have charged and be in combat for the remainder of the turn. Control zones have a big impact on this and how this works with enemy models, but control zones and charging is something we're going to be focusing on in a separate video, as it's quite a big topic and something that deserves its own little class. It's important to note that sometimes models will be unable to move. Generally this is detailed in whatever rules are specific to what's stopping the movement for that model. You're looking at if you've been affected by any magical powers, any commands, transfix, immobilize, that kind of thing, or if a model has already been charged that turn. Models that are knocked prone can only move up to half their maximum move value that turn as well. And then you repeat this process for each model in your army, for anyone who does want to move or has the option of moving. And then once you have moved all your models in your army, your opponent gets a chance to do the same thing before you finish the movement phase and move on to the shooting phase. There are some very important notes here that you've got to try and remember when playing your games. Models can never be forced to leave the board as a result of a magic power or enemy effect. The only time models can leave the board is if a scenario dictates it. For example, moving models off of the opposing board edge for scenarios like Reconnoiter is the only way which a model is actually allowed to leave the tabletop. A model's facing generally doesn't matter, with a few exceptions. The Mumakil is one that does actually have rules for its facing, and Candice Chariots as well. They allow you a 90-degree pivot for every 3 inches you have travelled along their 10-inch movement. So with few exceptions, facings do not matter. But as we always say here, theme is key. So it's much, much nicer to have models looking like they're fighting each other in combat rather than ones wandering off and facing off into space while being bludgeoned by enemy orcs. If there is also clearly a gap big enough for a model to fit through, but its base cannot fit, it's generally good conduct to agree with your opponent if that gap is sufficient to allow models through, even though the base doesn't fit. Generally speaking, you're looking at larger doorways and archways where cavalry models can clearly fit through, but their base doesn't quite allow them through. So always make sure you agree with your opponent before you start rolling dice. Try it where possible to minimise bending any of your tape measures or measuring implements while moving a model on the tabletop. This is just to allow the model's movement to be as accurate as possible and to avoid any potential wandering tape measures and maybe moving a model more than it actually has right to. A completely honest mistake to make, but something that can have repercussions on the game later on down the line if it continues. Well, there we go. That's Class 1 done. The first lesson of our Middle-earth Strategy Battle Game University is finished and complete. I hope you guys found this useful and helpful, and I hope you will tune in for next class, which I believe is coming out tomorrow, which will detail the shooting phase. Until then, guys, take care. Class dismissed.